Be looking in the book of Nehemiah together for the next few weeks, and what we'll notice if you read through, I'm sure many of you have read through Nehemiah in the last, probably month or so, I imagine. But if you have read through the book of Nehemiah, what you'll notice is that it's really kind of two different books. Not completely, but there's a real division. We think about Nehemiah, we think about rebuilding walls, and that's a big thing. But the walls are done by the end of chapter 6. And there's 7 more chapters. So it's not just about walls. But that rebuilding that takes place is an important consideration. And what God does after is an important consideration as well. So we're not going to be looking at the entire book of Nehemiah in this series. We're just going to focus on the first half. Well, I want the second half too. Well, good. A few months we're going to get back to that too. We'll get there. But I want to focus our attention over the next several weeks on this concept, this thought of rebuilding a life. One of the things that Miss Joyce and I like to joke about is many of you may not be aware of the fact that we were in the same church when she was in nursing school and Bible college, and I was like 3, 4, 5 years old. My dad was her college class teacher in the church there in Missouri. So what's fun is for Joyce and me to sit and reminisce together about our college friends. And we do. We'll talk about things that happened in the Calvary class and skits they did and funny things that happened. And we're remembering the same stories, now albeit from a little bit different perspective perhaps, but we were both there. And it's exciting. And every time we do that, one of the things my wife comments on is, how do you remember that stuff when you were that little? I don't know. I remember all kinds of useless things. But I really think one of the reasons that I do have a lot of very distinct and very crisp and very clear memories from childhood is because when I was about 5, 6 years old, we moved from one house in Springfield to a second house in Springfield. And after a couple years there, we moved to Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And we lived in 3 different houses in Hattiesburg, Mississippi over the course of about 3.5 years. And then we spent 9 months in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then we moved to Buffalo, Missouri when I was about in the 5th grade. And I really think that one of the reasons that I have very clear memories of childhood is because there are very distinct points in my life where we started over. Many of you who have been in one place all your life, things kind of blur together, don't they? Because you've been in one place, and it's all. I have trouble here now thinking about. I lose track of things that have happened here, and think, oh, that was probably 5 or 6 years ago, and you go back and no, that was like 15. You've been in one place for a while, and things kind of blur together. But when you have those times in life that require you to start over, it grabs your attention. Doesn't have to be negative, but those places of restarting, starting and rebuilding, do grab your attention. Well, as we consider this book of Nehemiah here, there's definitely a point of restarting and rebuilding that is not built on something positive, but built on something much more negative. I appreciated what one writer described the book of Nehemiah as part chronicle and part unvarnished prayer journal. And we'll see that as we read through Nehemiah together over the next few weeks. There are times that Nehemiah just gets pretty frank with what's going on and what he was thinking and what he was praying about. And it's a challenge and encouragement for us. What's interesting for us too, just kind of laying a little background for us today, is that this book of Nehemiah, when you look at the Old Testament in our Bibles, the way it sits, Nehemiah is kind of about in the middle of the Old Testament, right? But if you start in Genesis and start reading through, what you'll notice is that Nehemiah is the last narrative book in the Old Testament. Nehemiah is the last book in the Old Testament that's describing historically what was taking place in a chronological historical order. It's the end of the history. And we're going to see that a little bit more here in just a minute. But the point is, it concludes the story that started with Adam and really leaves us in a place where we're set up waiting for the arrival of Jesus. And again, we'll see that in more detail in just a minute. So that's an interesting place to consider the book of Nehemiah and where it sits and what's going on here. So as we look at Nehemiah, I just want to look at the first 4 verses this morning and do something to get us started and maybe kind of set us up a little bit for considering this concept of rebuilding a life over the next few weeks. Nehemiah chapter 1 and verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. And it came to pass in the month Kislev, in the 20th year, I was in Shushan, or Susa, the palace, that Hanani, one of my brothers, came. This was either a physical brother or a relation, kinsman. He and certain men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. So as we consider starting out here, where is Nehemiah and where are God's people at this point? Where are they right now? Well, in order to understand where they are, you kind of have to know a little bit about the story of the nation of Israel and where we are in history and how we got here. So let's ask that question. Where are they right now, and how did Nehemiah and God's people get to where they are? Being a preacher, I like things that are alliterated, that all start with the same letter. And sometimes I come up with those on my own, but sometimes other guys do a better job. And as I was trying to think about how to convey quickly and briefly the kind of story of the nation of Israel, of God's people in the Old Testament until we get to this point, I found another pastor done a really good job and used some words that all start with the same letter. So it'll help me remember and help you remember, maybe kind of walk through the story. How did they get here? Well, think first about the word rescue. As we think about the nation of Israel as we know it, the first place that we really see the nation talked about is in Egypt. Now we know that they are descendant from Abraham and his 12 sons, but that though they and their families had taken up residence in the nation of Egypt. But over time, as they had grown and prospered and become a nation of hundreds of thousands, the Egyptians started to get a little nervous and said, we need to put a thumb on these guys, or they're going to overrun us. And they put the Hebrews, the descendants of Abraham, under slavery. And God sent Moses in to tell Pharaoh to do what? Let my people go that they may worship me. And so he sent Moses in and sent those 10 plagues upon the nation of Israel to bring them out of the nation of Israel. But he brought them out again. He said, Moses, tell Pharaoh to let my people go so that they may go and come and worship me. Because what God wanted to do with the nation of Israel was he wanted to establish relationship. So there's our next word, relationship. As they come out of Egypt, they know what Abraham's told them. That's been passed down from generations. But they really don't know God yet. And so God establishes for them his law on Mount Sinai and says, this is who I am, and this is how you will relate to me. This is how we will get along together, and this is what I will require of you. And I'm making some promises, fulfilling some promises that I made to your father Abraham. I'm going to put you in a particular land, and if you will obey me in this law that I'm giving you, then I will keep you in that land, sustain you in that land, and you'll see the fulfillment of my promises and have relationship with me. Well, that sounds like a great thing to experience. Problem is, it didn't last long. Almost immediately and continually, we see the people of God in rebellion against him. Remember, they're coming out of Egypt, and Egypt worshiped a whole bunch of gods. And they're moving into an area of the world that worshiped a whole bunch of gods. And so there was never really a time where the nation as a whole really, fully, completely did away with the false worship of other gods. It always continued to be a problem. And in fact, after David was established as king and his son Solomon expanded the reign, and then his sons Rehoboam and Jeroboam split the kingdom into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah almost immediately. Well, the northern kingdom of Israel never had a king that obeyed God. Southern kingdom of Judah had a few kings here and there that did, but for the most part, they were just as guilty of idolatry and rebellion against God as the nation of Israel. Well, one of the things that you'll notice if you go back to the law is that God had promised that if you will obey and do these things, I will keep you in the land and prosper you in the land. But if you disobey me, I will throw you out of this land and I will scatter you around the world. And eventually, that's exactly what happened. This rescue that God provided for his people, the attempted establishing relationship through the law, and the continued pleading with his people through the prophets to come back and to obey. But the persistent rebellion eventually led to a state of ruin. Nebuchadnezzar comes in and carts them off. As we look at what happened to the nation of Israel, after the reigns of David and Solomon, God's people fell into deep sin and conflict with one another. The kingdom marked by wickedness and idolatry. And then God would eventually use the Persians and the Babylonians, first the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians to bring his judgment of 70 years of exile upon the Israelites for their unfaithfulness to his covenant with them. So in 722 BC, the Assyrians came in and they deported the people from the 10 northern tribes of Israel, just carted them off and spread them throughout the known world. So if you think about where Israel is here, just this little spot that you'll see where we mark where Jerusalem is. The Assyrians come in first, and then ultimately in 586, the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar come in, destroy the city of Jerusalem, and he also had a deportation policy. See, it's hard to establish and build up national pride and patriotic fervor to overthrow a dictator when you're not living in your actual homeland. So that was kind of the thinking of these empires. If you want to keep rebellion to a minimum and keep it from happening, then just take the people that live there and move them somewhere else. Just scatter them around. It's kind of hard to be patriotic for hearth and home when you're nowhere near hearth or home. And so that's what they've done. So the rebellion of God's people led them to ruin. So this is where we are. About 586 BC, don't worry if you can't read this, and just kind of giving us a little bit of visual here. But 586 BC, that's where Jerusalem itself falls. The final nail in the coffin, if you will, of the visible nation having any sort of sovereignty at all. It's carted off. Well, God is still faithful even when we're not. And God had promised through Jeremiah and others that I'm going to send you into captivity, but I'm going to bring a remnant back. A remnant's a small part. You know, we understand what a carpet remnant is. It's not the whole thing. It's a leftover part. God says, I'm going to bring a small part back. So what we've seen so far already, this rescue that started in Egypt and was a continual ongoing thing, but the relationship that he wanted, the rebellion of God's people led to their ruin, but now God begins to fulfill his promise of return. He's going to bring a remnant back into this land. So that's where we were with the fall of Jerusalem. If you move forward just a little bit more, several years, you're going to see in the book of Ezra, the first part of the book of Ezra, we've got the situation here where Cyrus is a Persian who offers or issues a decree that allows Jews that want to return to their homeland. See, what's interesting is when you disobey God, he's going to bring judgment eventually. And so even though God's people disobeyed, and he used the Assyrians for the northern kingdom and the Babylonians for the southern kingdom to come in and be his instruments of judgment against his people, the Assyrians and the Babylonians exalted themselves, took pride in themselves, exalted themselves against God, and God eventually brought judgment to them too. So by the time we see ourselves here a few years later, what's happened is the empire of the Babylonians has been conquered by the Medes and the Persians. And so now Cyrus is king, and he's got a little bit different policy. He's not the deporter. He's got this policy that's more around kind of appeasement and treating people well. And so he issues a decree that those who desire to are allowed to return to their homeland. So with this decree of Cyrus, we have a man by the name of Zerubbabel, if you're looking to name a child or grandchild. We've got a man by the name of Zerubbabel who led about 50,000 Jews back. Now, 50,000 may sound like a lot, but if you consider the multiple millions that were deported, it's a drop in the bucket. It's very few. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But he led about 50,000 back to Jerusalem. And one of the things that they did there is they rebuilt the sacrificial altar that had been used to worship the Lord. And they laid the foundation for a new temple that had been destroyed, and they laid the foundation for a new one. Well, that sounds great. That's awesome. We're back. Well, not really. Because what you'll notice is that the temple was completed about 20 years later. We got the prophets Haggai and Zechariah that come in, and the foundation had been laid, but it sat idle for a long period of time. And it's Haggai and Zechariah that came back and said, we need to get this done. And so it was under them about 20 years later that the temple itself was finally completed. So that sounds great, but we're still not where we are yet in the text. Several years later, you'll see the book of Esther. And it was during this time that Esther becomes queen. And she plots or foils the plot of Haman that he desired from that plot. So then later, we have recorded for us in Ezra chapter 7, that Ezra himself brings a second group, another group, back to Jerusalem. And this time, they begin to practice and try to institute religious reform in the city. And we'll see a few years later that Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem with the mission of rebuilding the walls of the city. He's going to be there for just a couple years as a term of governor. He goes back to Persia for a while, but then about 20 years later, he's going to come back and serve again. And that's going to be during the ministry of the prophet Malachi, and that's going to be pretty much the end of revelation from God until John the Baptist shows up. So if you're wondering about all this history and what's going on here, that's kind of where Nehemiah is, because, well, basically you are here, where that red star is. This is where we are right now. So after all this history and all this circumstance and all that's happened, you'll notice that God had promised 70 years of captivity. That happened, but then in about 538, they begin to lay the foundation for the new temple, but it takes about 20 years or so for the temple to actually be rebuilt. And then once the temple's rebuilt, there's a gap of about 57, almost 60 years, where Ezra comes in and says, God's people still need to be revived. We're still not living in obedience to the God that we say that we worship. And he ministers to them for a couple years and helps them to get that temple completed. But then, well, there's a gap of about another 12 years or so, when eventually Nehemiah leads a third group of people back in. So with all this, where was Nehemiah and where were God's people at this time? Now we understand what we're reading about when we see in verse 3, they said to me, the remnant that are left of the captivity in the province are in great affliction and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and the gates are burned with fire. Now that sounds like a bad situation on its own, and it is. God's people living in the city where God said he would set his name, the city where the temple of God is located, that signifies to the nations of the world, this is where we worship the God of the universe. That city is in rubble and ruin. The walls are broken down, and that means the city has no real defense. The gates are burned with fire. There's no security there. The place is a mess. It's a dump. And that's a bad picture for God's people and God's place and God's city. But what makes it even worse is when we look back at that timeline and realize that the first group of God's people able to return to make a change in that had happened 70 some years prior. So it wasn't just that this had been sitting there for a little while. God's people had had opportunity for at least a generation for something else to happen. But when Nehemiah gets this report, this is what he hears. Where was Nehemiah and where were God's people? They were a remnant in ruin. And how did they get there? Well, as we've recounted, they got there, first of all, because of sin. The regular pattern of the people of God, from their very inception almost, had been continual rebellion and continually failing to be serious about their relationship and walk with God as a nation. And that eventually led to their deportation and led to the ruin of the city. So they got there initially because they sinned, but they stayed there because they had settled. See, here's the thing. They'd been deported to Babylon, and, well, Babylon was like, I guess, I don't know if it's the best. I started to use a particular city, but we have negative connotations of a lot of the bigger cities in the United States, so I won't try to do that. But basically, they were in kind of a, if you will, sort of a cultural backwater area, if you will, and moved to Babylon, to the cultural center of the world. And a very fertile and lush area between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And so these people who had been relocated basically dug in and set up life. And became, they started businesses and they became prosperous and comfortable and rebuilt a pretty good life for themselves. And so when the decree went out from Cyrus that you are free and allowed to return to your homeland, it wasn't, as one said, it wasn't kind of like, it wasn't, okay, you get to go home. It was, hey, you get to go back to where your grandfather was from. And there wasn't that desire, and there wasn't that sense of urgency to go back. And so they just kind of settled where they were. Things were fine. So they were there because they had sinned originally, but then ultimately because they had settled. So how did Nehemiah respond? Verse 4 tells us, it came to pass when I heard these words that I sat down and I wept and I mourned certain days and I fasted and I prayed before the God of heaven. Nehemiah mourned. And I would ask you today, have you been there? Have you been there in that situation where something has happened that has broken you? Something happened that took what you thought was life as you knew it and said, this is never going to be the same at this point. Many of you in this room, you know what it is to say goodbye to a spouse. Life's not the same after that. Some of you said goodbye to a child. Life is not the same after that. The marriage you thought was solid and good suddenly isn't. The second DUI hits. Your daughter is expecting. And that was not something anyone thought was happening. The pink slip comes. You been there? The phone rings with that diagnosis. And life as I know it is not going to be the same. Can't be the same. And there's grief. There's mourning. And sometimes it's a grief and it's a mourning that says, I'm not sure how I can continue. My mom, with her Texas accent, used to always say, well, life goes on. And as an angsty teenager, I'd get frustrated and say, I know life goes on. Just keep eating and the sun keeps rising, life will go on. But there's a difference between life and living, isn't there? Nehemiah heard this news and it broke his heart. He mourned. And what's interesting to me is that as Nehemiah comes to this place where he is broken, the response, yes, is mourning. The response is crying out. He is weeping. But what strikes me here is that what cuts Nehemiah is not actually something that's happened to him personally. We'll see this more as we go forward. But Nehemiah is actually in a pretty good place in life. Nehemiah's life is going pretty well. So what is it about this report that breaks him? What is it about this that causes him to say things can't continue as they have? Something has to be done. You been there? See, maybe it's something that makes you sad. Maybe it's something that makes you angry. That second debt notice comes in and you're like, all right, that's it. We are not going to continue to live this way. Where's that Dave Ramsey book? We're going to change something. Something's going to be different. All right, that's the last time that I'm going to put that jacket in my closet and struggle to get that thing buttoned. I got to do something about this gut. I got to do something. See, sometimes what happens in our lives is we're going to stay the same until, as it's been said, the pain of staying the same becomes greater than the pain of changing. It will hurt more to stay like I am. So I got to change. What strikes me again here is that Nehemiah is motivated and broken and moved to make an absolute change in his life by something that is going on with other people that he probably has never met, in a city that he has never personally lived in. But he's motivated by the fact that these are God's people in God's place, and God's glory is at stake. See, for you and for me, we can be motivated to make changes in our lives because something bad has happened, or because the pain of staying the same becomes too great and we have to change because it's going to require, we just can't continue to live the way we are because it's affecting me and it's affecting my life personally. Has there ever been a point that you have looked at your life spiritually and thought the same thing? Has there ever been a point where you said, you know what, I am sick of walking into church every week and just checking a box? If God is who he says he is, he deserves more than that. If God is who he says he is, he deserves all of me. This second place stuff has to stop. See, for you and for me, it's just as we get started, Nehemiah mourned and then he prayed. He went to God with this. And his prayer is beautiful. We're going to save it for next week. But what you'll notice as we read through Nehemiah is his prayer doesn't focus a lot on complaining. He spends most of his time confessing. He looks at where God's people are and acknowledges the fact that they are where they are because that's where they're supposed to be. I read someone here recently who talked about businesses when they struggle, or even churches as organizations when they struggle. And he says, you know, you can have all kinds of strategies, but understand something. The system by which you are operating is perfectly situated to give you the results that you're getting. The reason you're seeing what you're seeing is because that's what you're doing. And Nehemiah's prayer focuses on the fact that, God, this is a lousy place for us to be, but this is not your fault. We helped ourselves get here. So as we think about this, I want you to do something with me today. Just getting started this morning. Will you consider where you are? Where are you? I find it fascinating that the first response we hear from God in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam sinned and he and the woman tried to cover themselves and couldn't do it, and went and they heard God calling in the cool of the day and went and hid themselves. The first thing God says is, Adam, where are you? Hint, God knew where they were. He's not asking for his information. We parents are good at that, aren't we? We don't ask questions for information sometimes. We ask questions for conviction. Right? Excuse me, what are you doing? Oh, we can see what they're doing. We're wondering if that kid can see what he's doing. And the reason for asking that question is to get you to stop what you're doing and think about what you're doing so you do something else. Where are you? Where are you right now? Where are you in let's just be personal. Where are you in your relationships? Where are you in your marriage? Where are you as a parent? Where are you as a friend? Where are you in relationship to God himself? Where are you? What does that relationship look like right now? Maybe you're not pleased with what you see. Are there areas that you want to not look at in your own life? Let me focus on this over here because this is going pretty well. Don't talk to me about this over here. I'm asking you to look at that over there. See, here's kind of the neat thing about what I do up here with God's Word is as I open God's Word and just ask questions from His Word, you don't have to tell me anything. Because I'm not the one anybody answers to. But I'm asking you in the privacy of your heart before God, where are you? Would you allow the Holy Spirit to ask that question from you today? Where are you? And that's a hard question, Pastor. Oh, don't worry, I got a harder one. Will you consider how you got there? Well, because that person and those people and these things and this system and that government and this president and this, yeah, okay. Does life in a sinful world affect us? Absolutely. Are there circumstances that rise that we did not cause or control? Does that happen? Yes. But that's not really all there is to it, is it? How did you get where you are? Nehemiah was able to look at God's people there in that place of ruin and understand that they got there because they sinned and they stayed there because they settled. Are there some areas in your life? Again, listen, some things you don't control. Some things happen that are beyond what you can do. But are there areas in your life, or are there degrees in your life? Are there situations, that place that I asked you to look at that said, where are you? Are you there because of your choices? Are there choices you have made that were contrary to the teaching and the truth of God that have contributed to where you are right now? If you're breathing, the answer to that is probably yes. Maybe not all, maybe not even most, but some. Consider this. How long have you been there? Have we settled? Have we just decided to get comfortable where we are and just make it work? And we'll just stay there. See, remember again what we talked about. Look at this long gap of time. See, when I talk about something that breaks us and causes us to mourn and causes us to recognize that something needs to be done, that doesn't have to be something that happened in the last week or two. It could be something that you've been carrying around for years. Those walls were broken down and the gates were burned with fire in 586 BC. And Nehemiah shows up 70 years later and the walls are still not built. So will you consider how you got here? Again, remember, we do live in a sinful world. And some of that sin is mine. And the sin that is mine that goes unchallenged will wreak havoc in my world. The reality, too, is that my choices will outlive me. And could we remember something else? The majority of the people around you will always settle for the world's standard instead of striving for God's standard. If you're waiting for everybody else to get on the bus, just go ahead and get on the bus. Because most will choose the path of least resistance. Most will choose the path of immediate gratification. Most will choose self over God and over others. That's who we are as sinful people. Will you consider where you are? Will you consider how you got there? And will you consider something else? One of the things that we'll see as we go through, I want to focus on, as we go through this series, we're talking about rebuilding a life, which means what can you personally do to see areas of your life and situations in your life rebuilt as they need to be. But understand something. What we're reading here, all of us will read Nehemiah and say, I want to be Nehemiah. Well, I do too. Nehemiah is pretty awesome. But as we read through this book here, understand we're not Nehemiah. Nehemiah is a wonderful example. Nehemiah will do a lot of great things, and we'll see that, but Nehemiah is part of a bigger story. The story isn't Nehemiah, and the story isn't Nehemiah's story, and the story isn't your story. The story is God's story. And as you consider where you are in your life and the circumstances that you're dealing with, in the areas where you say, I could see some rebuilding needing to happen here, I want you to understand something. You and I find ourselves in the part of a larger story that has been ongoing from the creation. God began with revelation. And over, he will give revelation to tell us, here's what's true and here's what I require. But we consistently respond to him by rebelling against what he's told us. And that does lead to ruin. And over, he will come in and provide rescue. And as you read through the Bible, what you'll see is the same pattern happening over and over. It starts with Adam. And it continues through to Noah. When God says, all right, that's it, we're starting again. And saves Noah. And then builds from him. And God comes to Abraham and makes promises to him. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. So these individual people won't consistently obey God. How about a nation that God sets up for himself? Well, this nation doesn't obey God. The nation disobeys. Well, God says, all right, well, how about if I send you judges that will provide direction for you? Because you don't have a king, so let me send you, and you're not listening to my prophets, so let me send you judges. Well, no, they continued to rebel against God even when he sent judges. All right, well, how about a king? Let's give a king, and I'll give you King David, who's a great king and will do a great job. And David is a king, but you know what? David disobeyed God himself. And then Solomon disobeyed God even more, and Solomon's sons disobeyed God even more, so the nation under a king couldn't continue to obey God. And God brings judgments and casts them out, and the nations of the world rebel against God, and God continues to raise up kingdoms and take them down. And now he sends his people back to their homeland and says, you can reestablish again, but they cannot obey God. And you can't either. And I can't either. See, what we need is somebody that will come in like Nehemiah and will weep over the sin that separates us from God. And will weep over the fact that we fail to reflect the glory of God. We need somebody who will cry out, oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who stone the prophets and kill those who are sent to you. How often would I have gathered you together like a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you would not. You know, Nehemiah wept over God's people. Jesus came and wept over God's city. But Nehemiah had to confess, I and my fathers have sinned. Jesus was able to say, I do always those things which please the Father. Nehemiah went back to build physical walls around the physical city of Jerusalem where the physical temple of God sat. Jesus said, I am going to build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Nehemiah went back to help restore the walls of the city of Jerusalem where God had said, I will meet with my people in that place. Jesus said there's coming a day, and it's here now, when those who want to worship the Father, you're not going to worship on Mount Gerizim, and you're not going to worship on Mount Zion. You're going to worship the Father in spirit and in truth. Jesus said, I'm going to establish you as a royal priesthood, able to offer sacrifices that are made acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. See, what Nehemiah shows us all the way through is that we cannot do what we need to do. We need somebody greater than us. And that person is Jesus. So I want you to know and understand today that as Nehemiah mourned and wept and prayed to God over the fact that God's people were a remnant in ruin, I'm going to ask you, would you consider the redemption that is needed through Jesus Christ? Is that something that you have experienced yourself? Will you consider where you are? Will you consider how you got here? And before we draw to one last applicational question, one other aspect we're going to see through this series. What Nehemiah is doing is not primarily for himself. Nehemiah is driven by a desire to see an accurate reflection of the glory of God. Nehemiah wants the world around him to see his God for who he is. And he knows the only way that's possible is if God's people in God's place are a reflection of the glory of God. Paul said, as he was writing to the believers in Ephesus, in Ephesians chapter 3, he said, "For this cause I bow my knees unto the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, of whom the whole family in heaven and earth is named. I'm praying that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with might by his Spirit in the inner man, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ which passes knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God." He's praying that New Testament church together would reflect the glory of God. If we want to look for God's people in the Old Testament, we look for the nation of Israel and we look to worship in the temple. But if you want to look for God's people in the New Testament, you don't look to the nation of Israel, you look to the local church. You look to the body of Christ, visible and gathered. And I want to ask you, when was the last time that you looked at your church and responded as Nehemiah has? Will you allow yourself, especially those of us who have been here a long time, will you be willing to look at your church and acknowledge the walls are broken down, the gates are burned with fire, the enemies of God do not see the glory of God reflected as he should? What is your response? The people of Israel let Jerusalem sit there for 70 years. Little changes here and there. But it took somebody moved of God to look at that situation and say, God deserves better than this. And only God can change this. Nehemiah is not the change agent. God is the change agent. In your life, you are not the change agent. Jesus is the change agent. In our church, you are not the change agent. Jesus is the change agent. But Jesus works through people. So for you and for me today, will you consider where you are? Will you consider how you got here? Will you turn to Jesus in repentant prayer? Is it time to rebuild? Is it time to rebuild? In that relationship, in that area of habit, in your life, in your church. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it." Again, the difference between those two is not in hearing the words of Jesus. They both heard. but what are you building on? Hearing and doing. True rebuilding demands rebirth. That's something only Jesus can do. Let's pray together.